Hello, this is the follow-up video for Module 3. I want to begin by saying thank you to all of you. You came up with some pretty interesting ethical dilemmas there, and I think I responded to most of the threads in all of the different groups, so I think I've covered quite a few of the things I wanted to talk about there, so I'll try not to repeat myself too much. But there were a few things that I wanted to talk about that applied to pretty much all of the different groups, or at least most of them, and clarify a few things because this whole natural law theory and reasoning is a little complicated and takes a little working through to get the sense of it. So there are a couple things to talk about. First of all, a couple of people brought up a question about whether or not natural law varies from group to group. And I wanted to make it clear that it doesn't. Um, as I said in some of the comments, it can be a little confusing because one of the ways that we can figure out the natural law is by looking at different groups and seeing how they function and behave. Um, but really what we're doing when we do that is trying to get a sense of universal human nature, right? So that if I look at a whole bunch of different groups across wide spans of history, that's how I can get to an understanding of what is human nature and use that as the foundation for my ethics. Um, and so in some cases, there's going to be variations in some groups. There's going to be different ways of living out the principles. So, the way we show honor to our parents may vary from culture to culture, and that's all right. But the underlying principle is universal, that we should honor our parents. But it's not the particular ways that's done that we have to follow. And there could be some cultures where a culture becomes wrong on a certain issue, right? Where they may decide that you don't really need to honor your parents, or adultery is okay, or something like this. So that's why we look at a whole bunch of different groups. It's also important to note that natural law, at least the theory states, right, that it applies to everyone, right? So it's not dependent on whether or not a person agrees with it or not, right? It's basically kind of like the law of gravity. Look, the law of gravity applies to you whether you want to believe it or not. Um, and natural law is the same thing when it comes to morality. Uh, it says, look, adultery, murder, these things are wrong whether you think they apply to you, whether you think those rules apply to you or not. So that's one thing to clarify. Natural law is meant to be universal. Another issue that came up on a number of discussions was uh, the distinction between an act being immoral and the culpability for an act. And I believe I covered this in the module, but I want to just repeat it and make sure I covered it if I didn't. It's been a while since I recorded those, so it's hard to remember. But um, we can say that in certain situations, a person's culpability is reduced, right? That is their degree of responsibility for the action. But that doesn't change whether or not an act is moral or immoral, right? So if someone holds a gun to my head and tells me to rob a bank or to do something else immoral, um, it's still immoral to rob a bank. It's still immoral to kill another person or to do something else immoral. But the fact that a gun is being held to my head reduces my culpability, right? And this issue came up in some of the groups in regard to suicide, right? Suicide is immoral. It's the intentional harming of an innocent human life, even though it's your own. But in most cases, a great deal of the culpability is reduced or removed because most people who commit suicide are suffering from some sort of mental problem that reduces their ability to reason properly and therefore be held fully responsible for their actions. So that's important to keep that in mind, right? That just because we say an act is immoral, that doesn't mean we can't go on to say, well, look, because of the extreme circumstances this person was in, their degree of responsibility may very well be reduced. Which brings me to another important point that came up, I think, in pretty much every group in some form or another, and that's the issue of not judging people. This came up particularly in regard to discussions of homosexuality and abortion in a lot of the groups. A lot of people would say something like, well, I think it's wrong, but I don't want to judge people, so there you have it. Right? And I want to make sure I'm clear on this. Um, when we talk about not judging people, and in particular, a number of you said, well, look, the Bible says don't judge people. That's certainly true. Right? The Bible says we ought not to judge lest we be judged. But what it's talking about there is not simply saying, look, I believe this is moral or immoral. Right? If the Bible told us to never make moral judgments, it would be basically, well, it'd be flat out contradicting itself on a whole host of levels. Right? The Bible is full of moral judgments, and the Bible, in many places, tells us to make moral judgments about other people in certain situations. Right? So when the Bible says don't judge, it's not saying never make a moral judgment, never say what that person is doing is wrong, or never even tell someone, look, what you're doing is wrong. When it says don't judge, it means don't look down on other people because they do something wrong, or don't think of yourselves as better or more valuable than other people because they're doing something wrong. Right? It's a kind of hypocritical, holier than thou judgment that is being aimed at there. Right? It's not saying you can never tell someone else what they're doing is immoral. Because again, if the Bible said that, it would just be blatantly contradicting itself and blatantly contradicting what it tells us to do in a whole host of other passages. We do need to be able to make moral judgments. And to be honest, I'm willing to bet that pretty much all of you who said that in your thread are willing to make moral judgments in lots of other areas, right? Nobody says that about murder. Nobody says that about stealing. Nobody says that really even much about adultery, right? It's only kind of the politically controversial things like abortion or homosexuality where we say, oh, well, I think it's wrong, but I don't want to judge other people. Because our society has told us, well, don't say those things are wrong because that's not politically correct or sensitive. All right, well, we can come back to that again if you have more issues or questions on it. A couple other things quickly to wrap this up. One thing, again, is to clarify this principle of never intentionally harming an innocent person. Right? So it's important to recognize that all parts of that phrase are important. Right? So it's about intentionally harming. So, for example, in a war, if there are unintended innocent casualties, that doesn't violate this principle. Or never intentionally harm an innocent person, right? So if somebody is actively attacking others, or if somebody else has killed someone else, say like a murderer, then it's not necessarily true that we can never intentionally harm them because that person is no longer innocent, right? We can use self-defense, we can use justified war, and though it's more debatable, traditionally natural law has said in some cases at least we can use capital punishment. And then again, we should never intentionally harm an innocent human person, right? So this is not going to apply in the same way to animals, right? That we ought to treat them rightly, we ought to treat them humanely, we ought to allow them to fulfill their nature as much as possible. But we can intentionally harm animals in order to eat or in order to do other important things for ourselves. All right, and then lastly, I just wanted to touch real quickly on the issues of abortion and homosexuality. On abortion, I commented this, I think, in pretty much every group, right? The real fundamental issue is this a person or not? And if it is a person, it's not clear why really difficult circumstances like rape, like a woman's health being endangered, I don't want to deny that those are serious and difficult, but serious and difficult circumstances don't justify the intentional killing of innocent people. Now, if we flip it around and say, well, look, we think ultimately it's not really a person, then the challenge is, okay, well, how do you define what makes a person in a way that allows you to carry out abortions, but doesn't allow you to, say, kill infants or kill certain disabled people, right? And this is a real problem. Peter Singer, who I've noted before as one of the prominent utilitarians today, basically points out this problem and turns it around and says, look, this is just the way it is. Right? He says infanticide should be permissible because he believes it's basically the same as abortion, that there's no reason we ought not to do it. So if you're going to say abortion is moral but infanticide is not, the difficulty is going to be explaining why it is, but infanticide is in fact immoral. And in homosexuality, again, we talked about the not judging people. I did want to briefly touch on the issue of whether it's natural, right? Did God create homosexual people? And if he did, then shouldn't they be able to live homosexual lives or commit homosexual acts? And the distinction here is a question of, again, what we're looking at as human nature in general, right? So it may very well be the case that there are some people who have a predisposition biologically to same-sex attraction. That doesn't make it human nature in the natural law sense to be homosexual, right? All of us probably have certain predispositions that make it more difficult for us to live rightly in certain aspects. Some of us may struggle with eating moderately. Some of us may struggle with drinking moderately. Some people might struggle with maintaining right behavior when it comes to their heterosexual attraction. So there are all kinds of different areas where we may be biologically predisposed to have difficulty in living rightly. And it may be the case that some people have a biological predisposition to struggling with same-sex attraction. That means we should be compassionate. That means we should be understanding. We shouldn't be holier than thou. But from a natural law perspective, it doesn't ultimately change the morality of homosexual acts, which, if we look at human nature in general, are contrary to the way human sexuality is meant to function. All right, so we covered a whole lot of ground there, but there were things I wanted to clarify. Hopefully, we will keep making progress, and we'll come back to a lot of these things in Module 4, and let me know if you have any questions or concerns.